From childhood, we take certain things for granted, not even thinking about their value. However, there are those who did not have such basics as parental love and support. Amber Gibson, unfortunately, did not have the opportunity to feel the warmth of a family atmosphere in her short life. Despite being a good person, life treated her cruelly and unfairly. Amber Gibson was born into the family of Peter and Anne Marie Gibson. In addition to her, the family had an older son, Connor. The small family lived in a disadvantaged area of South Lanarkshire, Scotland. Although the mother and children suffered from such an environment, the Gibsons could not afford anything better and were forced to put up with these conditions. Unlike other family members, the father fit perfectly into this marginal environment. He loved to drink but hated to work, so the whole family barely made ends meet, existing on government assistance. The money was barely enough for the bare necessities. The life of the Gibson family could hardly be called carefree. Not only did the man not care about the fate of his family, but he also turned out to be a real domestic tyrant with a cruel character. The children grew up in an atmosphere of cruelty and constant fear from an early age. Fortunately, the daughter got less, but her older brother had been subjected to violence since early childhood. The greatest suffering fell to the lot of his wife, Anne Marie, whom the man regularly beat, not being ashamed of the presence of children. The woman said that this happened constantly, but she did not dare to fight back and protect herself and her children. In the end, unable to bear it, she turned to the police. The investigators took up the case and brought charges of cruel treatment against the man. During the investigation, Peter did not even try to hide his cruel nature. He continued to threaten his wife, so she seriously feared for her life. Fortunately, this circumstance played against the aggressor and became proof of his guilt in court. Peter was sent to prison not only for domestic violence, but also for numerous offenses and crimes committed by him from 2001 to 2008. All of them were distinguished by special cruelty. The man undoubtedly posed a serious threat to society. One of the most revealing crimes was an attack on a little boy whom Peter beat with his hands and feet, inflicting serious bodily injuries. At the same time, he could not explain the reason for his aggression. He simply could not control himself when he was angry and lashed out at the first person he saw, right? As it turned out, this was not the only such incident. In addition, it was proven that one day the man raped a woman. He attacked her, tied her up, and began to strangle her. The victim admitted that at some point she reconciled herself to the inevitability of death, but the inhumans suddenly stopped the abuse. For all these crimes, Peter received 10 years in prison. It is clear that against the background of such behavior of the father, the children could not grow up in a calm and happy atmosphere. They were brought up in an atmosphere of fear and cruelty. Connor got the worst of it, suffering from physical violence and moral pressure from early childhood. Fortunately, the situation changed in 2008, when the father was finally put behind bars. At that time, the older child turned 5 years old, and Amber was only 3. It seemed that finally the family would be able to breathe a sigh of relief. However, after her husband's arrest, the mother began to abuse alcohol and lost interest in the children. The Child Protection Services took Connor and Amber from the family and placed them under the care of foster parents, the couple Craig and Carol Niven. They sincerely sympathized with these unfortunate kids who were simply unlucky to be born into such a hostile, unhealthy environment created by their biological parents, Wamam. The Nivens had long dreamed of having children, but could not have them. The foster son and daughter became the best opportunity for them to show their parental love. However, not everyone shared their desire to take other people's children into their care. Connor and Amber's biological grandparents also claimed custody of their grandchildren. They were convinced that the Nivens were taking foster children only for the sake of financial assistance from the state. However, their objections did not prevent the couple from formalizing custody, and the children moved to live with them in Hamilton, Scotland. Amber was remembered by everyone as a sweet, kind girl. Despite her modest character, she was cheerful and full of life, and it seemed that her cruel father had not had time to ruin her disposition. Although the first years of Amber's life were full of suffering, she retained a bright soul, was smart, and developed beyond her years. The girl loved art and singing, which pleased her new family. Unfortunately, the same could not be said about her brother Connor. The violence he experienced at an early age left its mark on his personality. From an early age, he had behavioral problems. He was withdrawn and had difficulty getting along with peers at school. The boy was known for sudden outbursts of anger, during which he could attack anyone. In character, he increasingly became like his father. Most often, the victims of his aggression were girls. Despite his attractive appearance, Connor was quite a cruel young man and liked to make creepy jokes. Connor had a habit of joking about death, and his cruel jokes shocked those around him more than once. Because of this, classmates avoided him, considering him an unpleasant and dangerous type. But no one suspected that Connor was quite serious about killing children and animals. People thought he just had a weird, dark sense of humor. Against this background, the boy had almost no friends. The reason for this was not only his specific humor and difficult character. It turned out that he had been struggling with mental disorders for a long time, which scared everyone. The teenager actively used the internet, maintained pages on social networks where he wrote creepy things. In one of his posts during his school years, he described his ailments in detail. It was obvious that at that time, he had difficulties with socialization and understood what he was facing. But the illness turned out to be stronger than Connor. He wrote that he suffered from bulimia, depression, anxiety, and attention deficit disorder. Of course, he also had problems with academic performance. Some teachers considered the young man to be mentally retarded. He showed no interest in learning at all and often skipped classes. Unfortunately, no one conducted any tests or analyses to confirm these suspicions. Therefore, Connor's exact diagnosis remained unknown. Being a teenager, he found himself alone with his age-related and mental problems. Connor complained that people did not accept him, paying attention only to external manifestations. In fact, he did not consider himself a bad person, but simply wanted to cope with the consequences of his father's tyranny. The boy was convinced that it was his father who was to blame for all these problems. Despite his desperate attempts to socialize, the young man could not find common ground even with his own sister, who was only a few years younger. The foster parents tried not to leave them alone, knowing that it could end in conflict and even a fight. The children were separated from an early age, so that their meetings and contacts took place under the supervision of adults. But even under the control of elders, Connor picked on his sister at the slightest provocation, so the foster parents sent them to study at different schools so that they could not intersect in any way during breaks. In high school, Connor was transferred to specialized educational institutions for teenagers who suffer from social, emotional, and behavioral problems. Amber attended a regular school during this period. As they grew older, the children faced new challenges, and Connor had great difficulty with them. He could not find a girlfriend for quite obvious reasons. His aggression scared everyone away, and of course no girl wanted to build a relationship with him. This made him very angry, so attacks on his sister became systematic. He literally looked for a reason to get hooked and take out all his aggression on her. The situation in their relationship became so aggravated that at the age of 14, Amber could not be under the same roof with him, being afraid of her brother. The girl insisted, and she was sent to an orphanage. At the same time, Connor continued to live with his foster parents until he reached the age of 18. In 2020, he also moved out from them because he was tired of their guardianship and took part in a Hamilton project called Blue Triangle. The essence of the project was to provide a hostel for people who did not have their own housing. In fact, he began to live in a homeless shelter. During their separate living, Amber and Connor continued to see each other, but communication was quite tense. As before, they constantly had conflicts. But now that the brother and sister were at a distance from each other, it became a little easier. They had fewer reasons for quarrels. Unfortunately, this could not protect the heroine of the story from new cases of cruelty in her life. In June 2021, the girl was attacked by 20-year-old Jamie Stars and raped, for which he received 10 years in prison. Before that, he had been released from prison on bail, where he spent several months. Interestingly, he was also charged with another sexual assault on a woman. The guy was already under 2 articles. Nevertheless, he was released on bail, and Jamie attacked again, this time Amber. The girl received psychological trauma and took a long time to recover from the attack. She continued to maintain contact with relatives and friends who supported her. She was very upset about what happened. At the same time, her brother remained indifferent and uninterested. During this period, Amber desperately sought support, so she tried to get close to everyone she considered relatives, including Connor. On November 26, 2021, Amber told her friend that she was going to meet with her brother. The girl was excited because they had not communicated for a long time, and she hoped that he had changed. Amber sincerely believed that the old conflicts would be forgotten, and finally, they would be able to talk calmly as brother and sister. During this period, the girl was still in the orphanage unit. Connor himself applied to the management to organize their meeting. She was let go to communicate with a relative. It was assumed that she would spend several evening hours with him, after which she would return. Amber's friend tried to dissuade her from this idea because Connor had previously shown cruelty to her, but the girl still went to meet with her brother. Amber posted a selfie with Connor on her social media page, and in this photo, she looked happy. No one else received any news from her. Around midnight, Amber's brother returned to his hostel. He immediately went into one of the offices and turned to an employee. Later, Amber admitted that he scared her with his unkempt appearance and strange behavior. Connor seemed gloomy, looked disheveled, out of breath. His hands were dirty up to his wrists. The employee was worried and asked if everything was okay with Connor, but he ignored the question, instead asking to make a phone call. According to the guy, he had a quarrel with his sister and had to leave in a hurry, but now he had cooled down and wanted to make sure that she safely reached the orphanage. The young man did call there, but they said that she never came for the night. After that, the employees of the institution turned to the foster parents, but they also did not see Amber. Initially, the meeting of the brother and sister took place in the house of the foster parents. Then the teenagers went for a walk to discuss some issues in private. It was after a walk in Cadzo Glen Park that the brother and sister parted, and he went to the hostel. After that, a statement was filed with the police. The girl was declared missing. As it turned out, Amber did not have a boyfriend. She could not run away. All her things were left in the hostel, so the police had suspicions that something bad had happened to her. Meanwhile, Connor seemed extremely indifferent. Despite the fact that his sister had disappeared, he did not even contact his foster parents to share his experiences. The young man made absolutely no effort to find out about his sister's fate. He just sat and waited. During this period, the police had already begun a search, and it was necessary to obtain at least some leads. It was logical to turn to the person who had last contacted Amber. Of course, the investigators came to Connor, who confirmed that they had walked together in the evening. However, according to him, as always, a dispute began between them. They quarreled, after which Connor left, leaving his sister in tears in the park. Then, the young man said that he wandered around the outskirts for a long time before getting to his hostel. Connor admitted that he knew these places poorly, which sounded very strange, because he literally grew up here. However, he insisted that he got lost, and even fell into a ditch in the dark, which is why Connor was so dirty when he turned to make a call. The young man's words immediately aroused suspicion among the detectives. He was able to easily point on the map where he met his sister, where they spent time in the park, and in what place he left her. However, he suddenly became confused when asked approximately where the ditch was located. The investigators tried to find out who Connor was with at that time, who could confirm his words. But the guy did not want to answer these questions. He was confused and tried to evade answers. The police failed to get anything out of him. In the end, he was simply released, and the investigation into the disappearance continued. 2 days had passed since Amber's disappearance. On November 28th, around 10:15 in the morning, a 45-year-old man named Stephen Corrigan contacted the rescue service. He said that while walking in Cadzo Glen Park, he stumbled upon the body of a girl, but according to his own confession, he did not immediately contact the emergency services. Stephen told a creepy story about how he first raped the body and only then called the police. According to him, he felt remorse about this and decided to confess. When investigators arrived at the scene, which was 200 meters from the bridge where Amber was last seen, they immediately began to check the suspicious man's words. The body was in a terrible condition. The victim was severely beaten, naked, and clearly raped. Later, forensic experts confirmed that Stephen's DNA was indeed found on almost all parts of the deceased's body, including intimate ones. Corrigan reported that upon seeing the body, he dragged it away from the road. So that no one would notice him, he did his dirty deed and covered it with branches. It was here that the body was found by detectives. At that time, he became the main suspect not only in the rape, but also in the murder of the teenager. After the forensic medical examination, it was possible to identify the body. The deceased, as expected, turned out to be 16-year-old Amber Gibson. This news came as a real blow to everyone who knew her. When Connor found out what had happened, he posted a farewell post on his social media pages dedicated to his beloved sister. He regretted that Amber had left so early and was saddened by the fact that no one else would know what a wonderful person his sister was. Local residents, upon learning about the creepy find, were very frightened. People brought flowers to the park where the body was found. No one could imagine what had happened to her, and most importantly, who could have done this to young Amber. Around the same time, Connor contacted the local newspaper. He wanted to give an interview to talk about his sister. The young man called her a beautiful person and wanted people to know who this girl with a tragic fate really was. The local journalist scheduled a meeting time for December 2nd. He appeared in a small cafe, but Connor was never seen there. This is because at that time he was already arrested on suspicion of murdering Amber. When the body was on the forensic expert's table, the specialist immediately found 8 bruises on the girl's neck that corresponded to the picture of manual strangulation. In addition, she received several blows to the head with a blunt object, which led to a serious traumatic brain injury. A hematoma was found in the brain caused by prolonged beating. In addition, the deceased had a disfigured face, a broken nose, which means she was brutally beaten. Due to the inhumanity of the attack, it was assumed that the killer had a personal motive. According to the forensic expert, Amber was first attacked, beaten, and after a blow to the head, the girl lost consciousness. But the cause of death was strangulation, which occurred after that. Near the body, the victim's clothes and underwear were found. They were badly torn, as if they were torn off in a rage during the rape. The body was heavily smeared with dirt with obvious signs of being dragged along the ground. The strangest thing was that Amber's death occurred 2 days before Stephen Corrigan contacted the police. At the time of death, the man had a confirmed alibi, which means that someone else was to blame for her death. Then Amber's brother still aroused serious suspicions with his strange behavior. Investigators knew about the guy's cruel character and constant conflicts with his sister. It turned out that Connor reported Amber's death on social media a few hours before the body was found. How could he have known about this? At that time, the teenager was still listed as missing. Moreover, the brother was the last one to see her alive. This aroused suspicion in the police, and they began to take a closer look at Connor and look for evidence to bring charges against him. The detectives managed to find footage from surveillance cameras, thanks to which the last moments of the girl's life began to clear up. She was walking with her brother, first through the city, then they walked across the bridge near the park. A young couple appeared on camera recordings at 9:57 p.m. Just before that, at 9:51 p.m., Amber took a selfie with Connor and posted it on her social media page. In this image, she appeared happy. This suggested the meeting was going well, and they were likely heading towards the park where the body was later found. Approximately 1.5 hours later, the young man was seen returning alone, with no one else visible in the recordings. Connor was also tracked on cameras located on the facades of the dormitory where he lived. Before entering the building, he discarded part of his clothing in a trash container, which looked extremely suspicious. Police officers searched the containers and managed to find the jacket the young man had been wearing on the night of his sister's murder. Notably, he did not dispose of the rest of the clothes he had been wearing at that time. Traces of dirt and blood were found on the young man's jacket, as well as on his shoes. After forensic analysis, it was proven that the blood belonged to Amber, implicating him in the attack on his sister. In reality, Connor did not dispose of most of his clothes and shoes because he simply didn't have spare items. The young man couldn't afford new shoes and clothes. Otherwise, as the detectives were certain, he would have thrown them in the trash without hesitation. Instead, the suspect wiped them clean of dirt and blood, but not very thoroughly, which played into the hands of the police. They were able to detect traces of DNA. All of these belonged to his sister. Blood was also found on Amber's underwear. Analysis showed that it did not belong to her. The traces, as it turned out, belonged to Connor. He likely injured his hand when the girl was struggling. Additionally, Connor's bodily fluids were found on her body, indicating he had assaulted her. Now investigators could directly link him to the committed crime. Detectives checked the young man's mobile phone. It turned out that the day after the murder, around noon, he sent a message to a messenger group. There were 5 people in it. Connor was asking everyone for help with the search. 40 seconds after this, he sent a message to his sister, asking if she was all right. Later, he wrote to the group again and said that help was not needed and it was a bad joke. Then the suspect made search queries in his browser to find out how to avoid phone tracking, as well as how to protect data if the police were to check it. He was clearly trying to learn how to cover up the crime more effectively and not get caught. During the inspection of his mobile phone, another unpleasant side of the brother and sister's relationship was revealed. Judging by Amber's correspondence, he had previously assaulted her and threatened retaliation if she told their adoptive parents or the police. This became one of the reasons why the girl wanted so badly to move out of her foster family's home at 14 years old. Amber kept silent about this event due to threats from her brother, or perhaps she loved him too much to turn him in to the police. But it seems that shortly before her death, the girl decided to tell her adoptive parents about it, and this could well have become a motive for murder. The investigation reconstructed an approximate picture of the events of that bloody night. Presumably, Connor met with his sister, and they did indeed go for a walk, hoping to mend their relationship. The recordings showed them calmly communicating. Everything seemed quite normal. Then they wandered into the park, where the conflict began. Most likely, it was provoked by the young man, and it happened spontaneously. On the other hand, it was not ruled out that what happened was planned by the perpetrator in advance. Perhaps the brother intentionally invited her to meet, led her to a deserted place to attack, assault, and kill his sister. Either way, Connor carried out his intentions towards Amber. As a result, the girl died from strangulation by hand. The young man left the body in the same park, and when he dragged it to another location, he left it literally on the footpath. On December 2nd, 2021, 18-year-old Connor Gibson was arrested, never having met with the journalist, in an attempt to create an image of a grieving brother. He was charged with the murder and assault of his own sister. Despite all the evidence of his involvement, Connor continued to deny guilt in the crime. But the police had too much direct evidence against the young man, so his guilt was beyond doubt to anyone. Amber's blood was found on his clothes and shoes, and his DNA traces remained on her body and underwear. He was recorded on cameras near the crime scene and had no alibi. The police also relied on data from the suspect's mobile phone when he made specific queries. He never managed to find the right website that would advise him on how to hide his data. After Connor's arrest, his adoptive parents repeatedly made statements against him. The problem of social adaptation, how communication was built with other students at school, acquaintances in the homeless shelter, always caused great concern for those close to him. Connor had very dark interests, and his relationship with his sister never seemed loving or warm. The correspondence between them about previous incidents of assault was also used against him. After news of Amber's death arrived, Connor did not appear concerned or upset. It seemed he was simply indifferent to this fact. Obviously, the young man thought his attempts to deceive the investigation would be effective. This clearly indicated a low level of intelligence and could be a reference to mental health issues that distorted reality for the young man. According to the foster parents, they also couldn't contact Connor during these days until Amber's body was discovered. He showed no interest in the search operation, despite the concern of everyone around him. This case caused significant public resonance. All the townspeople were in shock, given all the gruesome details and such a strange coincidence where the victim suffered violence from two people at once. Upon learning the whole truth about this, the public simply didn't know what to think. It turns out that before this incident, two dangerous monsters who craved blood and could attack at any moment were roaming free. Now justice awaited them. In reality, the amount of evidence against Connor allowed for such a solid foundation for the prosecution that the defense attorney had literally nothing to refute. The defense unsuccessfully tried to prove that investigators didn't show CCTV footage that would have captured Connor's direct attack on the girl. They believed that the brother did indeed go for a walk with her, but didn't try to harm her. However, the lawyer couldn't explain the killer's DNA traces on the girl's underwear and body. Any argument sounded simply unconvincing. Unfortunately, there were no surveillance cameras in that deserted crime scene, so the moment of the attack wasn't recorded. Nevertheless, there was more than enough evidence of his guilt. The trial lasted 13 days, after which the jury went to deliberate on the verdict. The jurors unanimously found Connor Gibson guilty of murdering and assaulting his 16-year-old sister. He received a life sentence. Despite the brutality, he was given the right to apply for parole after 22 years of imprisonment. After this, it was time for 45-year-old Stephen Corrigan, who confessed to assaulting Amber Gibson's dead body after discovering her on the park path. During the trial, the man couldn't really explain why he did this when he found the murdered body. According to him, the defendant couldn't resist and pounced on the victim with the intent to assault her. In fact, the prosecution long doubted what specific charge to bring against the man. Eventually, he stood trial for obstructing justice. His DNA samples were found on 39 different areas of the deceased's body, which indeed complicated the investigation. The defense referred to Stephen's father, 79-year-old William Corrigan. The man claimed that his son Stephen was a decent person and couldn't have abused the girl's body. He simply refused to believe it. According to the father, shortly before this, Stephen was in the family's shared house, behaving calmly and not being aggressive. Moreover, not long before the incident, he fell and severely injured his hand. The father believed that in such a condition, Stephen couldn't have done anything to the girl's body, no matter how much he wanted to. However, he couldn't explain the numerous DNA samples of his son found all over the murdered girl's body. Obviously, during his walk, Stephen shouldn't have had any contact with the victim's body, but one way or another, it occurred. He wasn't acquainted with Amber, and his DNA appeared on the body after her death. Stephen's ex-wife testified in court, claiming that the man was prone to violence. According to her, Stephen had attacked her, beat her, and she feared for her life. Therefore, the woman wasn't surprised that he was involved in the crime. The defendant's lawyer was still trying to find a reasonable version of what happened to mitigate his client's guilt. The defense attorney claimed that Stephen found the body and moved it into the bushes so that no one else would stumble upon the gruesome discovery. Supposedly, the defendant took care of the victim and other passers-by in this way. After this, he immediately contacted the police and reported finding the body. The lawyer called his confession of necrophilia an ill-conceived joke. In any case, moving the body wouldn't require leaving traces all over the deceased's body, including intimate areas, as well as leaving male fluids. This clearly happened for another reason. Stephen was also found guilty of the charges brought against him and sentenced to 9 years in prison. The most shocking aspect of the crime to everyone was that the girl was betrayed by her own family member. From childhood, they had faced their father's cruelty and mother's indifference, but this didn't bring them closer together, so later, the children spent a significant amount of time in foster care and orphanages and were separated from each other due to Connor's aggression. Amber always hoped to mend their relationship, despite warnings from friends and violence on his part. She went to this meeting to give him a chance, but, as it turned out, she was walking towards her death. However, Connor wasn't moved even by these painful speeches. Throughout the entire trial, he behaved completely indifferently and showed no emotions. Of course, the killer's mental state raised significant questions. He clearly had mental disorders that played a key role in this crime. He grew up in an aggressively unhealthy environment and was older than Amber, so he had remembered their father's cruelty, which the whole family suffered from, much better. The lawyer insisted that the young man had been asking for help for a long time, as evidenced by his social media posts where Connor talked about his problems and how he was trying to cope with them. Unfortunately, no one ever heard him. Amber's biological grandparents, who had never managed to gain custody of the children in their time, blamed the foster parents for the tragedy that occurred. In their opinion, they weren't directly guilty, but indirectly guilty because they didn't pay proper attention to the troubled brother and sister. The relatives continued to insist that the only reason they adopted the children was for state assistance. As soon as the foster parents received the money, they immediately showed indifference to the new family members. The grandparents also claimed that all the children of this couple were in similar danger. As it turned out, Amber and Connor weren't their only foster children. The foster parents denied such allegations. They assured that they tried their best to support the troubled children, but it was very difficult. In particular, for their own safety, it was decided to send Amber to an orphanage to keep her away from her brother. The foster parents insisted that they didn't know about previous instances of violence. After turning 18, Connor himself expressed a desire to move to a homeless shelter, and he couldn't be stopped. For some time, the brother and sister tried to communicate normally, and the foster parents only tried to facilitate this. Unfortunately, none of them could have imagined how it would all turn out. So, This tragic story about the fate of 16-year-old Amber Gibson, who became a victim of brutal murder and assault by her own brother Connor, shows how important it is to pay attention to children's problems, especially those raised in dysfunctional families. 1. Despite the foster parents' attempts to help Amber and Connor, they couldn't prevent this terrible event. 1. If you found this story interesting and want to learn more about similar cases, subscribe to the channel. Mom. There you'll find many other fascinating stories about crime investigations and human destinies.